Let us begin our reflection by reading Genesis 6:1-4. This is one of the most mysterious passages in Scripture and appears immediately before God's decision to send the flood. The text says that the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful and took them as wives. It also states that in those days the Nephilim were on the earth, described as mighty men and men of great renown. This passage raises many questions and, throughout history, has received different interpretations. The expression "sons of God" appears in other biblical books associated with heavenly beings, while "daughters of men" clearly refers to humanity. This creates tension in the text. Was this a union between spiritual beings and humans, or was it speaking of men who abandoned God's ways and joined themselves to a corrupt society? More important than identifying exactly who these characters were is understanding the central message of the passage. The author's purpose is to show that human corruption had reached an extreme level. It was not merely a matter of isolated sins, but a deep degradation of moral values and of God's created order. Soon after, the text explains that human wickedness had multiplied on the earth, and that people's thoughts were continually inclined toward evil. This prepares the reader to see that the flood was not an impulsive act of God, but a just response to a humanity that had completely turned away from the original purpose for which it was created. Over the centuries, biblical scholars have sought to understand who the sons of God mentioned in Genesis 6 were. Three explanations have become the most widely recognized within theology. The first interpretation states that they were fallen angels. This view was common among ancient Jewish traditions and was supported by writers such as Flavius Josephus. It also appears in the Book of Enoch, where the sons of God are described as heavenly beings who abandoned their proper place and became involved with human women. The second interpretation understands the sons of God as the descendants of Seth, who were considered godly, while the daughters of men belonged to the line of Cain, marked by rebellion. The central issue would have been the mixing of those who sought to live according to God's ways with those who rejected them. The third interpretation views these figures as ancient rulers or tyrannical kings. They would have used their authority to take women by force, symbolizing abuse of power, violence, and social oppression. Despite their differences, all three views agree on one essential point. There was a breakdown of the order established by God and a deep moral corruption. The biblical text is not focused on satisfying our curiosity about who exactly these sons of God were, but on showing the outcome of their actions. A society dominated by violence, sin, and complete separation from the Creator. In addition to the biblical account of Genesis 6, several ancient Jewish writings help us understand how this episode was interpreted in early times. Among them are the Book of Enoch, the Book of Jubilees, the Book of the Righteous, and the Book of Giants, which mentions figures such as the giant Og. The New Testament shows that these traditions were already known in the time of the apostles, when it states that Enoch prophesied about divine judgment, Jude 1:14. According to these writings, the sons of God were called watchers, heavenly beings who left their proper place and began to live among humans. These texts explain that such beings took human women and taught forbidden knowledge, including magical practices, organized violence, astrology, and methods of warfare. From this union came the giants known as the Nephilim, who are portrayed as extremely violent and responsible for spreading even more corruption across the earth. The Book of Jubilees emphasizes that this mixture accelerated humanity's moral decline. The Book of Giants presents stories of these beings fearing divine judgment. The Book of the Righteous also preserves similar traditions, connecting the giants with widespread violence before the flood. According to this ancient perspective, God intervenes. The flood brings an end to the corrupt generation, and the rebellious beings are judged and restrained. It is important to remember that these books are not part of the biblical canon. They do not carry the same authority as Scripture, but they are valuable for understanding how ancient Jews interpreted Genesis 6. More than satisfying curiosity, these writings reinforce the central message. When humanity breaks the boundaries established by God, the result is chaos, violence, and complete separation from the Creator. The word Nephilim comes from the Hebrew root nephal, often understood as the fallen ones. This term appears in Genesis 6 to describe figures who lived before the flood and were known for their strength and reputation. The Bible explains that in those days there were men of great size and influence on the earth. Later, in Numbers 13, the spies report feeling extremely small when they saw these people, comparing themselves to insects. This shows how intimidating and powerful they appeared. From a biblical perspective, the Nephilim are not presented as heroes, but as symbols of a world dominated by violence and moral decay. Their existence reflects how far humanity had moved away from God's original purpose. Ancient writings, such as the Book of Enoch, describe them as destructive giants who consumed everything and spread suffering. These traditions reinforce the idea that their presence was linked to chaos and corruption. Symbolically, the Nephilim represent the union of human sin with spiritual rebellion. They are not signs of glory, but evidence that the balance between heaven and earth had been broken. Their story prepares the reader to understand why divine judgment became necessary. The Bible presents the flood as a response to a world that had reached a deep level of moral corruption. The problem was not only the Nephilim, but the overall condition of humanity. Evil had multiplied, and human thoughts were continually directed toward wrongdoing. Violence filled the earth, and the creation that was meant to reflect God's goodness became marked by injustice and destruction. The flood was not a sudden act of anger, but the result of a long process of spiritual decline. At the same time, God's judgment also revealed mercy. Noah and his family were preserved so that humanity could begin again. The flood became a reset point in history, a chance for restoration and renewal. Ancient texts like the Book of Enoch describe the earth itself crying out for justice because of the corruption caused by the Watchers and the giants. This poetic language shows how unbearable the level of evil had become. Therefore, the flood can be understood as three things at once: purification, restoration, and a new beginning. It was not only about destruction, but about saving the future of creation. This message was not written to produce fear, but to awaken reflection. It teaches that when people ignore God's boundaries, destruction follows as a natural consequence of their choices. Jesus said that the days of Noah would resemble the days before the coming of the Son of Man. Humanity would repeat the same patterns of distraction, indifference, and moral blindness. Today, we no longer speak of Nephilim, but we still see similar signs: growing violence, normalized corruption, disregard for God, and moral confusion. Yet Noah's story offers hope. It shows that God always preserves someone who walks with him even in dark times. Noah was not perfect, but he chose obedience and trust, and because of that, he found favor with God. The question becomes personal. Are we living like the crowd or like Noah? This story also points forward to Jesus, who came to save humanity from a broken and sinful world. Just as Noah became a vessel of preservation, Christ is the way of spiritual rescue today. The flood reminds us that God takes sin seriously, but he also takes redemption seriously. There is always an ark prepared for those who choose to trust him. The story of the sons of God, the Nephilim, and the flood was not written to satisfy curiosity about the past, but to challenge the present. It shows how far humanity can fall when it abandons God's ways, and at the same time, how God never abandons his creation. In the middle of chaos, God raised Noah, a man willing to listen and walk faithfully. Judgment came, but so did grace. Where corruption ruled, God brought purification. Where death spread, God preserved life. Today, the same choice stands before us: to follow the crowd or to walk with God in the midst of darkness. Like Noah, anyone can find grace before the Lord. The final message is one of hope. Even when the world seems lost, God still offers salvation, restoration, and a new beginning through faith and obedience.